We often believe that the walls we build are enough to keep the world at bay. We lock our doors against the wind. We draw the blinds against the night. But sometimes, the silence inside the house is heavier than the storm outside. Tonight, we travel through the mists of 1934 to a cottage on the edge of the Puget Sound, where a card game was interrupted not by chaos, but by a sudden, heavy stillness. I know many of you are listening to this as a way to unwind from the noise of the day, perhaps seeking a moment of peace before sleep takes you. So before we begin, I invite you to lower your shoulders and take a deep breath. If you are joining us for a pain-enforced nap or simply looking to quiet a racing mind, let the sound of the rain and the steady rhythm of this story wash over you. I wonder what time it is where you are right now. The night is long, but we are awake together, safe in this shared space. The rain was falling particularly hard on the evening of March 28th, 1934. It drummed against the roof of the small cottages at Erland Point, Washington, a rhythmic warning that the ocean was always watching. Erland Point is a place where the fog rolls off the water and clings to the pine trees, dampening sound and blurring the edges of the world. It was the kind of cold that settles in the bones, a reminder of the deep, gray waters just a few yards away. Tom Sanders knew this weather well. As he stepped out of his own cottage that Saturday evening, the gravel crunched wetly under his boots. He pulled his collar up against the damp air, intending only to check the perimeter of his property. But the silence of the evening was broken by a sound that seemed out of place in the heavy mist. It was mournful and confused. The howling was coming from the Floeder cottage, a short distance away. It wasn't the aggressive bark of a guard dog, but the high-pitched cry of something small and frightened. Sanders walked toward the sound, his flashlight cutting a pale yellow cone through the darkness. The cottage stood dark against the gray sky. The paint was peeling slightly, worn by years of salt air, and the smell of wet cedar was thick in the air. In the rear of the cottage, Sanders found a large sedan parked in the shadows. Inside, 3 white poodles were pacing across the leather seats. When Sanders opened the car door, the dogs didn't attack. They leaped at him with frantic gestures of joy, desperate for comfort, their white fur stark against the gloom. They were happy to see a human face. This was the first sign that something was wrong, the absence of a master to calm them. Sanders turned his attention to the house. No smoke rose from the chimney, though the night was bitter cold. The blinds were drawn, but not all the way to the sill, leaving a sliver of the interior exposed to the night. He stepped up to the window and pressed his face near the glass. The powerful beam of his searchlight cut through the darkness of the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The light fell upon a card table. It was a scene of interrupted leisure. Chairs were pushed back. Cards were likely still on the table, perhaps a king or a jack looking up at the ceiling. But the players were not in their seats. Sanders recoiled, his breath fogging the glass. Sprawled on the floor, on either side of the table, were 2 bodies, Mr. and Mrs. Floeder. They looked as though they were resting, heavy and still. Sanders hurried to find a phone. 10 minutes later, the silence of Erland Point was disturbed by the arrival of Under Sheriff Rush Blankenship. The officers entered the cottage, their boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. The air inside smelled of stale tobacco smoke and the metallic tang of something else. It wasn't just the fleeters. As the officers moved through the dim room, their lights revealed 4 more still forms. Mr. and Mrs. Chenovert, Bert Balcom, Mr. Jordan. 6 people in total. All of them were well known locally, neighbors and friends who had gathered for a simple game of cards. They lay dead, the victims of bullet wounds and blunt force. A bloody hammer found on the floor told a brutal story of the final moments. The pockets of the victims had been turned out. Wallets were empty. The motive appeared to be robbery, simple and cruel. But there was a strange stillness to the scene. The game had ended, but the players had not left the table. The rain continued to beat against the windows, sealing the cottage in a watery tomb. The investigation that followed was a slow, methodical filtering of the town. A huge dragnet was thrown out immediately, like a fisherman casting into the dark waters of the Sound. Orders were issued to bring in anyone showing signs of a struggle or wearing blood-stained clothes. Dozens of men were brought in for questioning. They sat in hard wooden chairs under the glare of police lamps, explaining their whereabouts, their bruises, their lives. But in every instance, they were able to prove their innocence. The wounds were old, the alibis held. The dragnet came up empty, catching only driftwood and seaweed while the true predators swam away. Weeks turned into months. The rain kept falling. Public indignation rose to a fever heat, demanding answers. But then, as often happens, it faded into resignation. The cottage at Erland Point sat empty, the secrets of that night gathering dust. It began to look as if Washington's most sensational crime would remain a ghost story, whispered about in diners and on fishing boats. Time moves differently when a mystery remains unsolved. The seasons changed, turning green leaves to gold and then to brown, burying the memory of that night under layers of time. It wasn't until January of 1935, nearly a year later, that the silence began to crack. William Severance became the new sheriff. One of his first acts was to call in his chief criminal deputy, O.K. Bodia. Bodia was a man of patience. He knew that the best detectives in the Northwest had already failed. He knew the trail was cold. But he also knew that secrets are heavy, and eventually, someone always drops the weight. It happened in a beer parlor in downtown Seattle. It was a warm afternoon in early September. The parlor was dim and smelled of hops and sawdust. Glasses clinked, and the low hum of conversation filled the room. Bodia was there, blending into the background, just another man with a drink. But his ears were tuned to a frequency others missed. 2 men were sitting nearby, deep in earnest conversation. Their voices were low, but not low enough. Bodia heard a reference to the Erland Point killing. Then a name was mentioned. Leo Hall, and an address, 710 Columbia Street. It is strange how secrets are kept. We hold them tight, thinking they will protect us, until a casual conversation in a warm room unravels everything. Bodia didn't move. He didn't arrest them. He simply listened, finished his drink, and walked out into the daylight with a thread in his hand. He began to pull on that thread. He learned that Leo Hall was one of 3 brothers. He learned that Leo had a history, a suspended sentence for auto theft, a bullet wound from a past escape attempt. He learned that Leo had a pal named Larry Paulus, a bootlegger currently sitting in the county jail. Bodia visited Paulus. He didn't interrogate him. He simply chatted. He mentioned Leo Hall casually, as if talking about the weather. Paulus stiffened. The air in the cell seemed to drop a few degrees. A swell pal he turned out to be. Paulus sneered, the bitterness of betrayal leaking out. He runs out with my wife while I'm in here. But he better watch his step. I've got enough on him to burn him. Bodia carefully hid his elation. He leaned back, the picture of casual disinterest. Is that so? I'm talking of those 6 killings, Paulus whispered. If you want to learn more, you'll have to ask my wife. I heard her talk of it in her sleep. The capture of Leo Hall did not happen with a shootout or a high-speed chase. It happened with a handshake. Hall had been using the alias Mr. Stewart. He had been posing as a wealthy investor, preying on a man who had invented a new automobile carburetor. The inventor had grown suspicious when Mr. Stewart insisted on driving down unfrequented roads during a demonstration. He went to the police. When Mr. Stewart arrived for his next meeting, expecting to steal a car and perhaps another life, he was met by Detectives Malkorn and Eichenberger. They sprang from concealment and seized him. The man who had silenced 6 people was finally silenced himself. But the true weight of the story fell on Betty Burns, the woman Larry Paulus had mentioned. She was brought in for questioning. Under the gentle guidance of Detective Captain Yoris, the dam broke. Her confession was not a defiant speech, but a halting, tragic narrative told in a low voice. She spoke of being forced. She spoke of fear. She told the officers that she had thought it was a joke when Hall suggested robbing the Flyders, but when he went to his safe deposit box and took out a pistol and a hammer, the joke dissolved into terror. She described the drive to the cottage, the rain, the way Hall had bound the victims. She described the moment she realized he wasn't just going to rob them. She broke down as she spoke of the hammer, pressing her hands over her eyes as if to shut out a vision that had been burned into her mind for a year. I didn't know what to do, she sobbed. I ran out and he shot at me. For a year she had lived in agony, tortured by her conscience and the fear of Hall's retribution. Now, the words were out. The silence of the cottage was finally given a voice in the courtroom. On December 9th, 1935, the jury deliberated. It took only one ballot. Betty Burns was acquitted, seen as another victim of Hall's terror. Leo Hall was found guilty of first-degree murder. He heard the sentence calmly, displaying the same stoical indifference he had worn like a mask throughout the trial. He was sentenced to hang. Justice was served, and the cottage at Erland Point returned to its vigil over the Sound. The rain washed away the footprints, but the memory of the card game that never finished remained, a quiet marker in the history of the Northwest. As the rain continues to fall over Washington, another shadow was growing, thousands of miles away, in the bustling streets of Cincinnati. While the fog rolled off the Puget Sound, the air in Cincinnati was thick with the smell of yeast and sugar. It was a city with a deep German heritage, a place of bakeries and brick buildings, where neighbors greeted each other on the street, and trust was a currency as valuable as gold. In 1927, a woman named Anna Marie Hahn arrived in this community. She was an immigrant, full of energy and charm. She married a telegraph operator named Philip, and to the outside world, she seemed like a hard-working woman trying to build a life. She opened a bakery. She was a beloved niece to some, a friend to others. But trust is a fragile thing, easily dissolved in a glass of warm milk. Anna's bakery failed, and she found a new calling. She became a nursemaid, offering her services to elderly men who had no one else to care for them. These were lonely men, seeking comfort in their twilight years. Men like Erich Koch, Albert Parker, and Jacob Wagner. They welcomed Anna into their homes. They trusted her with their meals. They trusted her with their lives. They did not know that her kindness was a facade. Anna had a secret addiction to gambling, a hunger that consumed everything she touched. To feed it, she turned to a weapon that was invisible and cruel: arsenic and croton oil. She didn't use a gun or a knife. She used the intimacy of care. She served them bitter tea or medicine to soothe their ailments. She sat by their bedsides as they grew weaker, playing the role of the concerned nurse while she raided their bank accounts and forged their wills. One by one, the men faded away. The doctors, trusting the grieving nurse, signed the death certificates without suspicion. It seemed like a natural progression of age. But there was one man, George Heiss, who noticed something small, a detail so mundane it almost escaped attention. Heiss was another one of Anna's charges. One afternoon, she brought him a stein of beer. It was a hot day, and the condensation beaded on the glass. As the beer sat on the table, Heiss watched a fly land on the rim. It took a sip, buzzed erratically for a moment, and then fell dead. Then another fly, and another. Heiss looked at the dead flies, then at the smiling woman who had brought him the drink. He ordered her to take a swallow. When she refused, backing away with a sudden nervousness, he fired her. That moment of quiet observation saved his life. The pattern eventually unraveled. An autopsy on one of the victims revealed the presence of arsenic, enough to kill a man 4 times over. The bodies were exhumed. The poison was found in all of them. Anna Marie Hahn was arrested. Her trial was a sensation, but the reality was a tragedy of betrayed trust. She was sentenced to death. On the day of her execution, the first woman to be electrocuted in Ohio, her composure shattered. She did not go quietly. She pleaded with the warden, her voice echoing in the chamber. "No, no, no, Mr. Woodward, don't do this to me. Won't someone help me?" It was a desperate human cry, stripped of all artifice. But the machinery of justice, once set in motion, does not stop for tears. Just as Anna Marie Hahn used the quiet of the sick room to hide her crimes. Our next story takes us to a place where the warning came not from a person, but from the animals who watch over us. We travel now to the rural stillness of Wayne County. It was a night much like any other for Herbert Grice. He was a machine shop foreman, a man of routine and steady habits. He had returned home from work and was sitting in his living room, in the middle of untying his shoes. The house was warm. His wife Ruby was nearby. His 3 children were asleep in their beds. It was a domestic scene of perfect normalcy. But then, the dogs began to bark. Herbert's dogs were known to bark at anything: a squirrel, a passing car, the wind in the trees. Usually, Herbert would dismiss it. But this time, the barking shifted. It went from a casual alert to a threatening, guttural growl. The animals sensed something that the humans did not. Herbert stopped with his laces half undone. He stood up, turned on the porch light, and stepped outside to investigate. He called out into the darkness, expecting to see a stray animal. The reply was a shotgun blast. The sound shattered the night. Lead buckshot tore through the screen door, sending a cloud of plaster dust and wood splinters showering down like snow in the living room. Herbert sank to the porch floor, a puzzled look on his face, as if he couldn't quite understand why the evening had ended this way. The investigation that followed was led by Sheriff Paul Garrison. 10 feet in front of the house, in the tall grass, they found the first clue. It wasn't a weapon or a note. It was a flattened spot in the grass where someone had knelt, waiting. And there, scattered on the ground, were several wooden matchsticks. They had been chewed on. The wood was still moist with saliva. It was a nervous habit, a small, unconscious action left behind by a man waiting to kill. The deputies used their headlights to illuminate the area. They found tracks leading through a pine thicket to a dirt road. They noticed something specific about the footprints in the soft soil. The killer walked pigeon-toed, his feet pointing inward. And on the heel of one print, the word cushion was clearly visible. Friends and neighbors were brought in for questioning. Reached into his pocket and pulled out a wooden matchstick. He placed it in his mouth and began to chew. He disposed of the chewed stick in a nearby ashtray. It is remarkable how we betray ourselves. We construct elaborate lies, we create alibis, but our bodies hold on to the truth. Rufus sat calmly, believing his story was ironclad. But the grass holds memories, and the matchsticks in the ashtray told the same story as the ones in the yard. Rufus was arrested. His alibi fell apart. The Sunday school teacher, the friend, the man who walked pigeon-toed, was revealed to be the architect of the ambush. He had betrayed a friend, but a simple nervous habit had betrayed him in return. From the pine thickets of the South, we drift now to the vast, open plains of Nebraska. The year is 1927. The horizon here stretches endlessly, and the summer heat in July can be relentless, baking the earth until it cracks. Mona Wilson lived on a farm in Sheridan County. She was 31 years old, a woman who lived a quiet life with her husband in a small house on her parents' property. She was a loyal daughter, helping her parents, William and Olive Loomis, with the daily rhythms of farm life. On July 16th, a sickness swept through the farmhouse. Mona and her parents fell ill. Her father sent her to town, 22 miles away, to see Dr. Albert Molzahn. The doctor prescribed calomel tablets, a mercury-based medicine common at the time, and milk of magnesia. Mona bought the medicine and empty capsules to fill them with. That night, the heat in the farmhouse was oppressive. The doors were left open to catch any breeze. But by morning, Mona's mother, Olive, was dead. When Dr. Molzahn arrived, he didn't perform an autopsy. He didn't run tests. He looked at the body and declared she had died of strychnine poisoning. A half-empty bottle of strychnine was found in Mona's dresser drawer next to the empty capsules. It was a damning discovery. Mona's father, William, turned on her instantly. He accused his daughter and her husband of murder. He claimed the strychnine bottle was missing from his china closet. Mona was arrested. She was confused, grieving, and terrified. Under pressure, believing she was saving her husband from the electric chair, she confessed. She was sentenced to life in prison. But the story of Mona Wilson is not just about the crime. It is about the endurance of the human spirit in captivity. She was sent to the York Reformatory for Women. And there, amidst the walls and the bars, she found a strange kind of peace. She became a trusted inmate. She was put in charge of the prison dairy farm. Imagine the scene. It is early morning. The sun is just cresting over the Nebraska fields, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange. The air is crisp with frost. Mona walks to the barn, the only sound the crunch of her boots and the lowing of the cattle. For 10 years, this was her life, the warmth of the cow's flanks as she leaned in to milk them. The rhythmic sound of the milk hitting the metal pail. Ping, ping, swish. The smell of hay and sweet feed. In the repetition of the work, in the care of the animals, she found a rhythm that kept her sane. She was a prisoner of the state, but perhaps more so, a prisoner of a family secret that would never be fully told. Was it the calomel? Was it the strychnine? Or was it a father's resentment? The truth was buried with Olive Loomis. In 1937, Mona was paroled. She stood before the board and said simply, "I loved her as well as anyone loves their mother." She returned to her husband, Herman. They moved to Lincoln. The 1940 census shows them living quietly. She was a maid, he was a painter. They lived out their days in the anonymity of the working class. Her father remarried a woman 40 years his junior and lived into his 90s, the suspicion sliding off him like rain off a tin roof. Mona and Herman are buried now in Ash Hollow Cemetery, a pioneer resting place where the wind whispers through the long grass, carrying secrets that no longer matter to the living. The plains keep their secrets, burying them under seasons of snow and sun. And as we move west, to the final chapter of our night, we find one last secret hidden in the stumps of Oregon. The year was 1921. Roseburg, Oregon, was a quiet town, the kind of place where a professional like Dr. Richard Brumfield was held in high regard. He was a dentist, an educated man who had moved from Chicago. He had a respectable practice and a refined way of speaking. But beneath the polished veneer, there was a rot. Dr. Brumfield had a history of accidents, houses burning down, insurance checks collected. He was a man who saw the world as a ledger to be balanced in his favor. On July 13th, he decided to balance the ledger one last time. He hired a man named Dennis Russell. Russell was a hermit, a laborer who lived in a shack and tended a few sheep. He was described by the locals as shiftless and sullen. In the cold calculus of Dr. Brumfield's mind, Russell was a man society would not miss. Brumfield hired Russell to dynamite some tree stumps on his farm. It was hard, loud work. The smell of turned earth and the echo of explosions filled the valley. But the final explosion was not for a stump. Brumfield murdered Russell. He placed the body in his own car and staged a crash over a steep hill near Melrose. The car was set on fire. The plan was simple. The charred body would be identified as the dentist, and his wife would collect the $30,000 life insurance policy. Brumfield would vanish, a ghost with a fortune. But the perfect crime is a myth. It always unravels on the smallest thread. Investigators looked at the body. It was burned beyond recognition, but there was a detail that didn't fit. A detail so mundane it seems almost comical. The corpse was not wearing underwear. Dr. Brumfield was a man of habit and propriety. He always wore underwear. Dennis Russell, the hermit who lived in a shack, did not. This single, intimate fact sparked a manhunt. The dentist was tracked all the way to Alberta, Canada. He was brought back to Oregon, the sensation of the Pacific coast. He claimed amnesia. He claimed he couldn't remember. But the underwear and the dental records told the truth. He was sentenced to hang. But Dr. Brumfield, a man who always sought to control his own fate, denied the state its final act. On September 13th, 1922, he was found in his cell. He had used a bed sheet to hang himself from his bunk. He tried to erase a life to build a new one. But the truth is stubborn, and the dead do not vanish so easily. And so, the files are closed. The history is written. The rain continues to fall over Erland Point, over the streets of Cincinnati, over the fields of Nebraska, and the hills of Oregon. We have walked through the shadows of the past, witnessing the fragility of trust and the silence that follows violence. But here, in this moment, you are far away from those events. You are safe. The bad hombre is gone. The streets are quiet again. If you are still with me, take a moment to feel the weight of your blankets. Feel the stillness of your own room. The past is a distant country, and we have returned to the present. Let the darkness wrap around you like a heavy, protective blanket. There are always more mysteries in the archives, but they can wait for another night. For now, your only task is to rest. Let the sound of the rain carry you away. Drift off. Good night. Disclaimer: this video contains audio narration based on real events. No visual depictions of violence are shown. This content is designed for sleep aid, relaxation, and storytelling purposes. Tonight, we explore the baffling discovery at a cottage in Erland Point, where a card game was interrupted by a silence that would last for decades. We also travel to the plains of Nebraska and the hills of Oregon to uncover secrets buried by time. Drift off to sleep with this relaxing true crime storytelling session. Whether you are taking a pain-enforced nap or fighting insomnia, let my voice guide you through the details of these solved cold cases. Support the channel and ad-free listening. Merch, user insert link. Patreon, user insert link. My other channels, Unresolved Mysteries, at user insert link. History, at user insert link. I know many of you are tired. The world moves fast, demanding our attention at every turn. But here, in this space we have created, time slows down. Let the sound of the rain wash away the day, masking the noise of the waking world until there is nothing left but the steady rhythm of the falling water. Before you drift off, let us travel back to a time of shadows and silence, to a place where the fog rolls off the dark waters of the Puget Sound and secrets are kept by the trees. Tonight, we walk through the mists of March 1934. We find ourselves at Erland Point, Washington, a quiet stretch of land where the forest meets the sea. It is a cold, damp evening, the kind where the chill settles deep in the bones, a reminder that the ocean is always watching, always waiting. We are going to visit a cottage where a card game was interrupted not by chaos, but by a sudden, heavy silence. We will find the answers that history tried to hide. I wonder what time it is where you are right now. Perhaps the house is quiet and the lights are low. Perhaps you are joining us for a pain-enforced nap, needing a distraction from the discomfort of the day. Or maybe you are simply a member of the Insomnia Club, seeking a safe space to rest your heavy eyes while the rest of the world sleeps. Whatever time it is and wherever you are tonight, you are safe here. The past cannot touch us. We are simply observers, watching from the comfort of the present as the story unfolds across the miles. The year 1934 was a difficult time for the country. The Great Depression had cast a long shadow over the Pacific Northwest, just as it had over the rest of the nation. It was an era of scarcity, where trust was a currency as valuable as gold, and where people held tight to what little they had. In the remote corners of Washington state, far from the bustling streets of Seattle, isolation was a way of life. The cottages at Erland Point were not grand estates. They were humble structures, built of wood that had turned gray under the relentless assault of the sea salt and the rain. Imagine the texture of the Fleeter cottage on this particular Saturday night. The paint, once white, was peeling in long, thin strips that curled away from the damp wood like parchment. The roof was thick with moss, a soft green blanket that absorbed the sound of the drizzle. The air smelled of wet pine needles and the brine of the Sound, a sharp, clean scent that filled the lungs with the cold reality of the coast. It was a place where neighbors knew neighbors, yet the distance between the houses allowed for a certain privacy, a quiet agreement that what happened behind closed doors stayed there. Tom Sanders knew this silence well. He lived nearby, accustomed to the rhythm of the tides and the wind moving through the Douglas firs. On this evening, he stepped out of his own cottage, pulling his coat tighter against the damp air. He adjusted his collar, feeling the moisture cling to the wool. He had not intended to go out, but the night had been disturbed. It wasn't a scream that drew him out. It wasn't the sound of a struggle or the breaking of glass. It was the dogs. For some time, the mournful cries of animals had been drifting through the trees, cutting through the ambient noise of the wind. They were not barking in anger, but rather in a state of confusion, a persistent, high-pitched yelping that refused to settle. Sanders stood on his porch for a moment, listening. The sound was coming from the direction of the Fleeter cottage, a short distance away through the brush. He stepped off his porch, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. We can imagine the sensation of that walk. The ground was soft, saturated by days of rain, yielding slightly under his weight. The darkness was absolute, save for the beam of the searchlight he carried in his hand. The light cut a cone through the mist, illuminating the droplets of water that hung suspended in the air like diamonds. He walked slowly, the beam of his light sweeping across the wet trunks of the trees, catching the reflection of a puddle, the glint of a wet stone. The air was cold on his face, a stark contrast to the warmth of the home he had just left. He could hear the waves lapping against the shore in the distance, a rhythmic shushing sound that usually brought peace, but tonight seemed to underscore the unease of the dogs. As he approached the Fleeter property, the details of the scene began to emerge from the gloom. The cottage sat dark and still. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, which was unusual for such a cold night. In these parts, the hearth was the heart of the home, kept burning to ward off the damp chill that seeped through the walls. To see the chimney cold was the first sign that the rhythm of life inside had been broken. Sanders moved closer, his breath forming small clouds in the beam of his light. He navigated around the side of the house, the wet ferns brushing against his trousers. The howling was louder now, coming from the rear of the property. He rounded a corner, and the beam of his light fell upon a large sedan parked in the shadows. Inside the vehicle, 3 white poodles were pacing frantically. When they saw the light, they did not growl. They did not bare their teeth. Instead, they leaped against the glass with frantic gestures of joy. They were desperate for acknowledgement, desperate for a human presence to break the isolation they had been trapped in. It was a heartbreaking sight. Creatures of comfort left out in the cold, confused by the sudden absence of their masters. Sanders approached the car, perhaps murmuring a few soft words to quiet them. But his attention was drawn back to the house. The silence there was heavier than the noise of the dogs. He turned his light toward the windows. The blinds were drawn, but not all the way down. There was a gap at the bottom, a thin slice of glass that offered a view into the private world within. He stepped up to the window. The wood of the sill was damp under his hand as he leaned in. He pressed his face close to the glass, shielding his eyes from the glare of his own light. He directed the beam through the gap in the blinds, the light cutting through the dusty air of the interior. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light, swirling in the stagnant air. The beam traveled across the floor, illuminating a rug, the leg of a chair, and finally, resting on a card table. The game had ended, but the players had not left the table. It was a tableau frozen in time. A card table sat in the center of the room, the surface cluttered with the remnants of a Saturday night. There were glasses, perhaps half full, the liquid evaporated by the passage of time. There were ashtrays, and there were cards, kings and jacks and queens, laid out in patterns that no longer mattered. And around this table, the silence was absolute. Sanders recoiled. The beam of his light shook as his hand trembled. Sprawled on the floor, on either side of the table, were two forms. They were still. They were resting in positions that were unnatural, the heavy, final rest of those who have left the waking world behind. He did not scream. The shock was too deep for noise. He simply stepped back from the window, the darkness of the yard rushing back in to fill the space where his curiosity had been. He hurried to find a phone, his boots moving faster now on the gravel, the crunching sound loud in his own ears. 10 minutes later, the silence of Erland Point was broken by the sound of an engine. Kitsap County Under Sheriff Rush Blankership and another officer arrived, their headlights sweeping across the trees, casting long, dancing shadows against the cottage walls. They stepped out of their vehicle, their breath hitching in the cold air, and approached the house with the caution of men who know that silence is often more dangerous than noise. They entered the cottage. The air inside was stale, smelling of old tobacco smoke and the metallic tang that always accompanies tragedy. As they moved through the rooms, their flashlights revealed the full extent of the quiet. It was not just Mr. and Mrs. Fleeter who lay there. There were others, Mr. and Mrs. Chenovert, Bert Balcom, Mr. Jordan. 6 people. 6 lives that had converged for a simple game of cards, for companionship on a dreary Saturday night, now ended in a single, frozen moment. They were well known locally. People who had walked the streets of the town, bought groceries at the market, and waved to neighbors. Now, they were merely shapes in the dark, victims of a brutality that seemed at odds with the domestic setting. The officers moved with reverence, stepping carefully around the evidence. They noted the bullet wounds, the finality of the violence. They noted a bloody hammer lying on the floor, a common tool turned into an instrument of silence. They saw the empty pocketbooks, the wallets turned inside out, the meager possessions of the victims scattered like leaves. It was a robbery, yes, but the scale of it, The sheer finality of 6 lives taken for a handful of cash left a heavy feeling in the room. The rain continued to tap against the roof, a steady, indifferent drumming that marked the passage of time. Outside, the poodles in the car had quieted down, perhaps sensing that the wait was over, even if the reunion they hoped for would never come. The investigation that followed would be one of the most complex in the history of the region. A huge dragnet was thrown out at once, a wide, invisible net cast over the county in hopes of catching those who had slipped away into the night. Orders were issued to bring in anyone showing signs of a struggle, anyone whose clothes bore the dark stains of the cottage's secret. The police worked methodically. They were not action heroes. They were men doing a job, sifting through the debris of human behavior. A dozen suspects were brought in. They sat in hard wooden chairs in the sheriff's office, the air thick with cigarette smoke and suspicion. They told their stories. They showed their hands. And one by one, they were cleared. They had alibis. They had explanations. They were just men who had gotten into fights, or cut themselves working, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Weeks turned into months. The rain kept falling. The grass around the Flyder cottage grew tall, reclaiming the path that Tom Sanders had walked. The public indignation, which had risen to a fever heat in the days following the discovery, began to cool. It is the nature of things. The shock fades, replaced by a dull resignation. The killer's trail grew cold, buried under the layers of time and the damp earth of the Pacific Northwest. It began to look as if Washington's most sensational crime would remain a mystery. A story told in hushed tones by the fire, a warning to lock the doors and draw the blinds tight. But secrets are heavy things. They are hard to carry for long. And sometimes the break in a case comes not from a microscope or a fingerprint, but from a casual conversation in a warm room, miles away from the scene of the crime. It was January 1935. Almost a year had passed. A new sheriff, William Severance, had taken office. He was a man who did not like loose ends. One of his first acts was to call in his chief criminal deputy, a man named O.K. Bodia. He instructed Bodia to open the file on the Erland Point massacre, to blow the dust off the reports and look again at the silence. It was a tough assignment. The best detectives in the Northwest had tried and failed. The trail was not just cold, it was frozen. But Bodia was a patient man. He knew that criminals are human, and humans have a need to speak, to share the burden of their actions. And so we find ourselves in a beer parlor in downtown Seattle. It is early September. The air inside is warm, smelling of hops and sawdust. Men are leaning against the bar, their voices a low hum of conversation. Glasses clink, laughter erupts sporadically. It is a cozy scene, a refuge from the gray skies outside. Deputy Bodia was there, perhaps nursing a drink, perhaps just listening. He was off duty. But a detective is never truly off duty. His ears were tuned to the frequency of secrets. 2 men were sitting nearby, engaged in an earnest conversation. Their heads were close together, their voices low, but not low enough. Suddenly, Bodia heard a reference to the killing. He heard the name Erland Point. And then he heard a man's name mentioned several times, spoken with a mixture of fear and familiarity. Leo Hall. The name hung in the air, invisible to everyone but Bodia. He did not react. He did not jump up. He simply sat and listened, and memorized. He heard an address, 710 Columbia Street. Quietly, methodically, Bodia began to pull on this loose thread. He made inquiries. He learned that Leo Hall was the oldest of 3 brothers. He learned that Leo was 33 years old, a man with a history that was written in police ledgers. Bodia went to the records room. He ran his finger down the columns of names until he found it. Leo Hall. In 1932, Hall had been arrested for automobile theft. He had tried to run. He had been shot by an officer, a wound that nearly took his life. Because of his youth, and perhaps because of the severity of the injury, he had been given a suspended sentence, a second chance. But the record showed something else. It showed a connection. Hall had been friendly with a man named Larry Paulus, a bootlegger who was currently sitting in the county jail on grand larceny charges. Bodia decided to pay a visit to the jail. He walked through the echoing corridors of the prison, the sound of metal on metal ringing out. He found Larry Paulus in his cell, a man with plenty of time to think about the past. Bodia played it cool. He didn't demand answers. He simply leaned against the bars and casually mentioned the name Leo Hall. The reaction was immediate. Paulus stiffened. His face, which had been bored and indifferent, became grim. The mask slipped. A swell pal he turned out to be. Paulus sneered, the bitterness evident in his voice. First he promises me smokes that never come, and then while I'm tight in stir, he runs out with my wife. But he better watch his step. I've got enough on him to burn him. Plenty. Bodia hid his elation. He kept his voice even, his expression neutral. He prodded gently, like a man stoking a dying fire. What do you mean, burn him? The convict didn't need much prodding. Betrayal is a powerful motivator. I'm talking of those 6 killings, Paulus stated, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to echo louder than a shout. If you want to learn more, you'll have to ask my wife. I heard her talk of it in her sleep. She mentioned Hall's name. It is strange how secrets are kept. We hold them tight, thinking they will protect us, until a casual conversation in a warm room unravels everything. A promise of cigarettes broken, a wife stolen, a grudge held. These are the small, human cracks that allow the truth to seep out. The investigation shifted gears. It moved from a cold search for clues to a hunt for a man. But Leo Hall was elusive. He was like an eel, slipping through the fingers of the law, moving in the shadows of the city. But the police had a new lead. They had Peggy Paulos, Larry's wife. It did not take much pressure to make her open up. The weight of the secret had been pressing on her for months. With a dramatic suddenness, the announcement came. Peggy Paulos had confessed. The news was suppressed. The public was not told. The police wanted Hall to feel safe, to think he was still a ghost. They redoubled their efforts, watching, waiting. And then another break came, not from a detective, but from an inventor. A man walked into police headquarters in Portland, Oregon. He asked to see Captain Keegan. He was nervous, looking over his shoulder. He told a story about a new automobile carburetor he had invented. He needed capital. He had met a man named Mr. Stewart, who claimed to have money to invest. Mr. Stewart had seemed interested. He asked for a demonstration. But when they got into the car, Stewart didn't want to drive on the highway. He insisted on turning onto unfrequented roads, dirt tracks that led into the deep woods. The inventor felt a chill. There was something in Stewart's manner, a coldness in his eyes, that triggered a primal warning. He feared the man intended to harm him and take his car. Captain Keegan listened. He told the man to arrange another appointment. He promised protection. The next day, the trap was set. The inventor met Mr. Stewart at the agreed location. As the Stewart stepped up to join him, detectives sprang from concealment. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase, just the heavy hand of the law on a shoulder. Mr. Stewart was Leo Hall. Deputy Bodia traveled to Portland. He looked into the eyes of the man who had haunted his files. Hall refused to admit his guilt. He was stoic, a wall of silence. But the silence was crumbling around him. Another woman, Betty Burns, was picked up. Under the guidance of Detective Captain Yoris, she began to speak. Her confession was one of the most extraordinary ever filed. It was a story of how one man, with only a woman's assistance, had held up a cottage and taken 6 lives. Haltingly, in a low voice that barely rose above the sound of the rain outside the interrogation room, she told the story. She spoke of mentioning to Hall that the Flayers had money. He suggested they rob them. She thought it was a joke. But when he went to his safe deposit box and took out a pistol and a hammer, the joke ended. She was frightened. She tried to draw back, but Hall wouldn't listen. He forced her to go with him. As she described entering the house, she began to break down. She spoke of binding the victims. She spoke of the search for money. But when she came to the point where the silence began, where Hall began taking their lives in cold blood, she could no longer speak. She sobbed wildly, pressing her hands over her eyes as if to shut out the vision that had been replaying in her mind for a year. Oh, it was terrible, she cried. Terrible. I didn't know what to do. I ran out and he shot at me. She had lived in agony since that night. Hall had found her a week later and warned her. If she breathed a word, he would harm her too. Tortured by conscience and fear, she had remained silent until she could do so no longer. The trial was brief. On December 9th, 1935, the pair faced a jury. Betty Burns was acquitted. Leo Hall was found guilty of first-degree murder. 3 days later, he was sentenced to hang. He heard the sentence calmly, displaying the same indifference he had shown to the dogs howling in the night. On September 11th, 1936, the sentence was carried out. The evidence was conclusive. The silence of the cottage finally given a voice in the courtroom. The case was closed. The Flyder cottage returned to its vigil over the sound, the moss growing thicker on the roof, the memories of that night fading into the mist. As the rain continues to fall over Washington, washing away the traces of the past, another shadow was growing, thousands of miles away, in the bustling streets of Cincinnati. Let us leave the damp woods of the Northwest. Let us travel east, to a city where the smell of bakeries fills the air, and where trust is a fragile thing, easily dissolved in a glass of warm milk.